In 1853, the Ottoman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from the Balkans to Baghdad, from Algiers to the Arabian coast. On paper, it was among the largest states on earth. But paper was precisely the problem. The imperial treasury in Constantinople ran on a currency the world no longer trusted, and its revenues, extracted through a crumbling network of provincial tax farmers, arrived late, incomplete, and endlessly diverted. The Sultan commanded millions of subjects and could barely pay his soldiers. Then came the Crimean War. In 1853, Russia pressed south against Ottoman territory, and Britain and France, terrified of Russian expansion toward the Mediterranean, rushed to Constantinople's defense. War is expensive. The Ottoman state, already living beyond its means, needed cash immediately, and its new European allies were happy to introduce it to the great financial houses of London and Paris. In August 1854, the empire signed its first foreign loan, £3 million sterling, arranged through the banking firm of Dent, Palmers and Company, secured against the tribute revenues of Egypt. For a regime that had never borrowed abroad in 5 centuries of existence, it was a historic threshold. The money arrived quickly. It felt like salvation. Guns were bought, troops were paid, and the alliance held. But the terms hid teeth. The loan was issued at a discount, meaning Constantinople received far less than its face value, while owing interest on the full amount. A second loan followed in 1855, £5 million, this time guaranteed jointly by Britain and France, who insisted on supervising how it was spent. Foreign oversight had entered the empire quietly, wrapped in the language of friendship. To the ministers of the Sublime Porte, these arrangements seemed temporary, a bridge across a single war. They did not see the machinery behind the MIRAGE. That European capital, once invited in, would never truly leave. Each loan created appetite for the next. Each signature bound the empire tighter to exchanges it did not control, to bondholders it would never meet. The door opened in 1854, could not be closed. And within a single generation, the sultans would learn that borrowed gold, taken freely, is the most expensive thing an empire can possess. The Crimean War ended in 1856, but the borrowing did not. It accelerated. Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottoman government contracted at least 15 major foreign loans, a torrent of paper flowing through the banking houses of London and Paris. The stated totals were staggering, but the reality was worse, because almost none of that money reached Constantinople intact. Consider the mechanics. A loan advertised at £100 might be issued to investors at 70, sometimes as low as 53, as in the loan of 1865. The difference vanished into the pockets of underwriters and intermediaries. Yet the Ottoman treasury owed interest and repayment on the full 100. A nominal rate of 5% could translate, once discounts and commissions were counted, into effective costs of 10, 12, even 14%. The empire was paying premium prices for money it barely touched. Worse still was the purpose. By the 1860s, new loans were increasingly taken not to build railways or armed fleets, but simply to service old loans, to pay the interest coming due on debts already contracted. This is the arithmetic of addiction. Borrowing to pay for borrowing, each infusion buying a few more months before the next crisis. The financiers understood it perfectly. Every fresh Ottoman bond generated new fees, new commissions, new profit. Galata bankers in Constantinople and the great houses abroad grew rich, intermediating the empire's decline. Sultan Abdulaziz, who took the throne in 1861, spent lavishly on palaces, on ironclad warships, on a navy that ranked among the world's largest and served almost no purpose. The court glittered while the ledgers rotted. Provincial revenues were pledged in advance, again and again, promised to multiple creditors, mortgaging harvests not yet grown. European investors, hungry for high yields, kept buying, convinced the empire was too vast, too strategically vital, to fail. By 1875, Ottoman external debt approached £200 million, The annual interest and repayment obligations consumed more than half of all state revenue. The machine could no longer feed itself. Somewhere in the ministries along the Bosphorus, officials began to count what remained and found the treasury nearly empty. The reckoning was days away. In the autumn of 1875, the numbers finally spoke louder than the promises. The empire's external debt had swelled past £200 million, and its annual obligations to foreign bondholders had reached roughly £14 million a year, an amount that devoured over half the entire revenue of the state. There was no more room to borrow. The lenders themselves, sensing the danger, had begun to close their doors. And so, on October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that shook the financial capitals of Europe. It announced that for the next 5 years, it could pay only half of the interest due on its debt. The other half would be covered by new bonds, paper promises stacked upon paper promises. Within months, even that arrangement collapsed, and by 1876, the empire ceased payment almost entirely. It was, in plain terms, a default, one of the largest sovereign defaults the 19th century had ever witnessed. The consequences rippled outward instantly. On the exchanges of London, Paris, Vienna, and Amsterdam, Ottoman bonds cratered. Fortunes evaporated. Countless middle-class European investors, clergymen, widows, small merchants who had been lured by promises of high returns, discovered their savings were now nearly worthless. The abstraction of high finance became household ruin. Public outrage erupted in the press, and with it, political pressure. This was no ordinary bankruptcy. The Ottoman collapse coincided with revolt in the Balkans, Herzegovina rising in 1875, Bulgaria in 1876, and with a palace crisis in Constantinople itself. In May 1876, Sultan Abdulaziz was deposed and died days later. His successor lasted 3 months before being declared insane. By August, Abdulhamid II ascended to a throne perched atop a financial ruin, surrounded by rebellious provinces and encircled by angry creditors. The bondholders of Europe were not inclined toward patience. They had lent to an empire, and that empire had failed them. Now they wanted their money, and they possessed the diplomatic and military weight of the great powers to demand it. What began as a private matter between investors and a foreign state was about to become an instrument of imperial pressure. The creditors were beginning to organize. A single ruined investor is powerless. Thousands of ruined investors, organized, are a force that governments cannot ignore. In the aftermath of the 1876 default, the scattered holders of Ottoman debt across Europe began to combine. In London, bondholders formed committees to represent their claims collectively, coalescing eventually into the Council of Foreign Bondholders, an institution designed to negotiate on behalf of British investors against defaulting states. In Paris, French holders, who held the largest share of Ottoman paper, organized in parallel. These were private citizens, but they carried extraordinary weight, because behind them stood the diplomatic machinery of the most powerful nations on earth. The logic of the age was ruthless. A sovereign default was treated not merely as misfortune, but as an affront, a debt that a state was morally and politically obligated to honor. And the great powers had a well-worn method for enforcing such obligations. It was called gunboat diplomacy, the practice of stationing warships off a debtor's coast, of threatening bombardment or blockade until payment resumed. Egypt, nominally Ottoman, offered the nearby precedent. Its own debt crisis would soon bring British warships and, by 1882, outright military occupation. The message to Constantinople was unmistakable. But there was a subtler pressure at work, embedded in the diplomacy of the moment. In 1878, the Congress of Berlin gathered the great powers to redraw the Balkans after Ottoman defeat by Russia. Amid the territorial bargaining, the question of Ottoman debt hovered constantly. The empire's finances were now a matter of international concern, a lever to be pulled by any power seeking advantage. Creditors and diplomats spoke in the same rooms, their interests interwoven. For the bondholders, direct military conquest was crude and costly. What they truly wanted was reliable, permanent access to Ottoman revenue, a guarantee that would outlast any single sultan or crisis. They did not merely want to be repaid once. They wanted to install themselves inside the empire's financial body, to collect at the source, before the money ever reached the treasury. The negotiations that followed the default would produce exactly such an instrument, an unprecedented arrangement that transferred entire streams of Ottoman revenue directly into foreign hands. It would be sealed in 1881. On December 20th, 1881, Sultan Abdulhamid II issued a decree that would reshape the inner workings of his own empire. Known as the Decree of Muharram, after the month in the Islamic calendar, it settled the terms of the default by creating an entirely new institution, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. On its surface, it was a compromise. The empire's crushing debt was reduced by roughly half, from over £200 million to about £106 million, a genuine relief to the treasury. But the price of that relief was sovereignty itself. The administration was not an Ottoman agency. Its governing council was dominated by representatives appointed directly by the foreign bondholders, British, French, German, Austrian, Italian, and Ottoman delegates. This foreign-run body was granted an astonishing power, the right to collect entire streams of Ottoman revenue directly before those funds ever touched the imperial treasury. The pledged revenues read like an inventory of the empire's economic life. The salt monopoly. The tobacco monopoly, soon farmed out to a foreign-controlled company called the MIRAGE. The tax on silk. The stamp duties. The fish tax. The spirits tax. Revenues from entire provinces. All of these were ceded, handed over to the debt administration to gather and to funnel toward the European bondholders. The empire had, in effect, mortgaged its own daily commerce, the salt on its tables and the tobacco in its markets, to the investors of London and Paris. What made this arrangement so remarkable was its permanence and its intimacy. This was not a warship anchored offshore, threatening from a distance. This was a foreign institution planted inside the empire, operating in its cities, employing its clerks, reaching into its provincial towns to extract taxes at the source. The creditors had achieved precisely what they wanted, not a single repayment, but a standing machine of collection, embedded in Ottoman soil, immune to the whims of any sultan. The Decree of Muharram was meant to be a solution to bankruptcy. Instead, it planted a seed. That modest council of foreign accountants, established to manage a debt, would grow. It would spread across the empire, hire thousands, and become something no treaty had ever named, a state living within the state. By the mid-1880s, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration was no longer a committee of bondholders. It was a government. From its headquarters in a grand building on the Golden Horn, it commanded a workforce that swelled to more than 5,000 employees, then 8,000 by 1912. These were tax inspectors, warehouse clerks, customs agents, and accountants. A European-directed bureaucracy operating on Ottoman soil, answerable not to the Sultan in Yildiz Palace, but to creditors in London, Paris, Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. Its council seats were divided among the bondholders of the great powers, each nationality guarding its share of Ottoman flesh. The administration collected the salt monopoly, the tobacco revenues through the Rigi Company, the stamp duties, the silk tithe, the fisheries, and the spirits tax. In province after province, its agents proved brutally efficient. Where the Sultan's own tax farmers had skimmed, bribed, and lost revenue to corruption, the debt administration ran clean ledgers. By 1900, it was gathering roughly a quarter of all state revenue and handing it directly to foreign creditors before a single coin reached Constantinople's treasury. The paradox was total. The most modern, best-run institution in the empire existed solely to drain it. Ottoman peasants in Anatolia and the Levant paid their salt tax to a French clerk. Tobacco growers sold to a monopoly that jailed smugglers with its own armed guards, men who killed thousands over the decades in what amounted to a private fiscal army. The Sultan reigned. The accountants governed the wealth. Foreign investors noticed. A state that could not control its own taxes, but could guarantee repayment through European hands, was suddenly, perversely, creditworthy again. New capital flowed in, not as charity, but as opportunity. The debt administration became a seal of approval, a signal that any concession granted inside the empire would be honored, enforced, protected. And so the very machinery built to collect old debts became the gateway for new ambitions. The powers no longer wanted only interest payments. They wanted the empire's future, its ports, its mines, its unbuilt railways stretching toward the oil fields of Mesopotamia. The next wave of capital would arrive not on ledgers, but on steel rails. In 1888, a German syndicate led by Deutsche Bank secured its first Ottoman railway concession. It was the opening move in one of history's great imperial gambles. By 1903, the dream had a name, the Baghdad Railway, a line meant to run from Constantinople through Anatolia, across the Taurus Mountains, down to Baghdad, and onward toward the Persian Gulf. Kaiser Wilhelm II himself courted Sultan Abdulhamid II, visiting Constantinople and Damascus, casting Germany as the empire's friend against grasping Britain and France. Modernization was the promise. Steel rails, telegraph wires, stations, and progress. The reality was a deeper chain. Each kilometer of track came with a kilometric guarantee. The Ottoman government pledged fixed payments per kilometer, whether the trains earned profit or not. Where did that money come from? The Public Debt Administration, which pledged tithe revenues from the very provinces the railway crossed. The empire borrowed against its own soil to build the lines that bound it. And every power wanted its stake. France dominated the railways of Syria and the port of Beirut. Britain watched the southern terminus near the Gulf with alarm, fearing German steel pointed at India and at the oil beginning to matter around Basra and the wells of Persia. The railway was not merely transport. It was a claim, a physical stake driven into the body of a dying empire, marking who would inherit which limb. By 1914, the map of concessions had become a map of appetites. German engineers surveyed Mosul. British interests circled Mesopotamian oil through the newly formed Turkish Petroleum Company of 1912. French capital held the Levantine coast. Each loan, each guarantee, each mile of track drew the great powers deeper into the empire's economic organs, until the distinction between investment and ownership dissolved. The Ottoman state was now a network of foreign claims wearing the costume of a sovereign nation. All that was needed was a shock violent enough to convert those financial claims into borders. The debts were mapped, the oil was mapped, the railways were mapped. In the summer of 1914, the fuse was lit, and the accountant's map would be redrawn in blood and cartographers' ink. In August 1914, the Ottoman Empire chose Germany and sealed its fate. 4 years of war shattered a state already hollowed by 70 years of debt. But even before the guns fell silent, the creditors were dividing the corpse. In 1916, two diplomats, Britain's Mark Sykes and France's François-Georges Picot, bent over a map of the Arab provinces and drew lines. A straight stroke ran, in Sykes's words, from the E in Acre to the last K in Kirkuk. France would take Syria and Lebanon. Britain would hold Mesopotamia and Palestine's ports. These were not battle lines. They were investment portfolios made territorial. The regions France claimed matched the railways and loans French capital had financed for decades. The Mesopotamian lands Britain seized held the oil fields around Mosul and Basra that the Turkish Petroleum Company had already targeted in 1912. Financial claims became flags. After the Armistice of Mudros in 1918, the reckoning came. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 attempted to dismember Anatolia itself. The San Remo Conference of that same year converted wartime deals into legal mandates under the new League of Nations. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain took Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. The old Ottoman debt did not vanish. It was apportioned among the successor states, so that Iraq, Syria, and the new Turkish Republic each inherited a share of loans borrowed by dead sultans for wars long past. Diplomats drew borders through deserts they had never walked, splitting tribes, merging enemies, welding Kurds, Sunnis, and Shias into artificial states designed for administrative and extractive convenience. Mosul's oil determined where Iraq's northern border fell. The Mediterranean pipeline routes shaped Syria's frontier. Kuwait was severed to guard a British-controlled coast. The cartography of the modern Middle East was, in truth, the cartography of European ledgers. The salt tax, the tobacco monopoly, the kilometric guarantees, the oil concessions, all translated into national boundaries. The empire that borrowed itself to death in 1854 was buried in 1920, its grave marked by borders drawn to satisfy accountants. And those borders would not rest quietly. The lines drawn at San Remo and confirmed at Lausanne in 1923 were never meant to hold nations together. They were meant to hold assets apart. And so the 20th century inherited a Middle East engineered for conflict. Iraq, stitched from 3 Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, fused Kurds, Sunni Arabs, and Shia Arabs into a single state ruled by a foreign-installed king in 1921. The seams never healed. Uprisings, coups, and wars followed for a century. The Kurdish people, promised a homeland at Sèvres and denied it at Lausanne, were divided across Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran. A nation without a border, still fighting for one today. Palestine, held under British mandate to secure the road to Suez, carried the contradictions of the 1917 Balfour Declaration into a conflict that has not ended in over 100 years. Syria and Lebanon, split by French financial and sectarian calculation, fractured along the very lines drawn to serve creditors. The oil that determined Mosul's placement in Iraq rather than Turkey became the prize in wars stretching from the 1920s to the invasion of 2003. Every artificial border became a fault line. Every fault line became a battlefield. We tell ourselves these wars are ancient, tribal, eternal, hatreds beyond explanation. But they are not ancient. They are modern. They were manufactured, and we can date their manufacture. 1854, when the first loans arrived. 1881, when the debt administration seized the empire's revenues. 1916, when 2 diplomats drew a line from Acre to Kirkuk. The Ottoman Empire was not simply defeated by armies. It was consumed by interest payments, dismembered by bondholders, and buried beneath the borders its creditors designed to collect what it owed. The map of the modern Middle East is the map of a foreclosure. Its frontiers trace not rivers or peoples or faiths, but debts. The salt tax, the tobacco monopoly, the railway guarantees, the oil concessions. Look at any conflict there today, and beneath the gunfire, you will find the ledger. Follow the borders back through the ruins, through the mandates, through the loans, and one truth remains, written in a century of blood. Debt drew the borders that still bleed.